What's your problem then with Scottish Labour? Isn't the point that you need to get together to try and overturn the Nationalists to get into their enormous lead in the polls?
Well, that is the ultimate aim, is to get rid of this nationalist government. But what I was explaining today is the Labour Party don't provide an alternative. Just before Christmas, we had one of the most controversial pieces of legislation ever passed in the Scottish Parliament, the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, and Labour whipped their MSPs, despite strong objections from their MSPs, from Labour women, former Labour leaders and Labour voters, to support Nicola Sturgeon to pass that dangerous bill. And that's just one example where they side with the nationalists rather than with the public here in Scotland.
Isn't that broadly clever politics, though, Douglas Ross, in the sense that they have to try and eat into that enormous lead? Because you have got the basically 43% of Scots baked into wanting some kind of more independence or even full independence in Scotland.
There's absolutely nothing clever in voting for a bill that diminishes women's rights. We put forward amendments to try and stop sexual predators being able to use this bill to gain access to women-only spaces. That was defeated by the government, and then Labour still supported the bill. That's just one example. We had 150 amendments to try and improve this bill. Very few of them got through. It was shoddy legislation. It's now in the hands of the UK government, yet Labour helped to enact it. They did the same with the hate crime bill in the last Parliament, a bill that tries to suppress free speech here in Scotland, passed on the back of Labour votes. That's not an opposition. That's simply working with Sturgeon and her nationalist colleagues to enact dangerous legislation.
But these are all quite narrow areas, though, aren't they, Douglas Ross? I mean, do you want to go after more important areas like taxation, like the environment, like the oil and gas in the North Sea? These are areas which should really matter to Tory voters, to more voters in Scotland.
Yeah, and I mentioned all of them as well, Chris. I mentioned the fact that on North Sea oil and gas, Labour take the same position as the SNP on taxation here in Scotland. The Labour plan is to tax even more and to throw more money at public services. You cannot put a hair between Labour and the SNP here in Scotland anymore, and that is a betrayal of the voters who backed Anna Sawar and his party at the last Scottish election. He said he would stand up to the SNP, and then within days he was making a big open offer to work with Nicola Sturgeon.
How about the Tory party in the south of England? Are they actually helpful to you up north? I mean, the way the Labour have adopted this thistle, haven't they, rather than the rose, to try and appearing more Scottish. Do you want to break away from the southern party and get more of an identity for yourself?
We are a separate party up here in Scotland. I am the leader of the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party. We have a separate constitution, separate manifestos, etc. But we are, as I've been explaining today, the only party north of the border that's willing to challenge this cosy consensus that we now have at Holyrood with Labour, the SNP, the Greens and the Liberal Democrats, who on one side very rarely challenge the nationalist government that we've got, and on the other side you've got only the Scottish Conservatives that are quite often a lone voice of dissent and actually trying to scrutinise and improve what's happening here in Scotland.
You were no fan of Boris Johnson. There was no secret about that. Are you happier that you've got Rishi Sunak now as Prime Minister?
Well, I think what we've seen from the Prime Minister is, more stability within the government. We've heard his 5-point plan to deliver for the country, and he wants to be assessed against that. And I think people will see as we go into 2023 a greater emphasis on that stability throughout government. We already can see the support going to help families and businesses across the country, and that's what people want to see from their politicians, a focus on the real issues that matter to them. I mentioned today we've got teacher strikes coming up in Scotland, and we haven't heard from our Education Secretary. We've got NHS on its knees here in Scotland, and we've heard not a word from the First Minister. Where has Nicola Sturgeon been for the last couple of weeks? There has been silence from her and her government on the important issues, yet she's preparing to have a special conference in March to try and hold another independence referendum. Totally the wrong priorities for the people of Scotland.